Rose stepped out of the portal, finding herself in a forest unlike any she had ever seen. The trees seemed to glow with an inner light, and the very air hummed with a subtle, arcane energy. She knew immediately that she was in Alfheim, but beyond that she was in unfamiliar territory. Her knowledge of this realm was limited, gleaned from fragments of ancient texts and half-remembered stories. She knew of the Guardians, of course, the powerful beings who were said to maintain the balance between realms, but the details of their nature, their capabilities, were lost to her. She moved cautiously through the forest, every sense alert for any sign of danger. She had no idea how the denizens of Alfheim might react to an outsider, especially one from a realm as dark as Atherin. Her hand never strayed far from her whip, ready to defend herself if necessary. As she walked, Rose tried to recall what little she knew of Alfheim's geography. The texts had spoken of a great city at the realm's heart, a place where the Guardians were said to convene, but they had been frustratingly vague about its exact location or appearance. She needed to find that city, or at least some clue to the location of the Nexus where the pathways between realms converged. But she had no map, no guide, only her own wits and the vague directions gleaned from ancient tomes. Hours passed as Rose wandered through the endless forest. The light never seemed to change, making it impossible to tell how much time had passed. She grew increasingly frustrated, aware that every moment spent lost in this strange realm was a moment Ultranacious Eternus remained unchallenged. Just as she was beginning to despair, Rose spotted something through the trees, a glint of light that didn't seem to come from the ever-present glow of the forest. Cautiously, she made her way towards it. She found herself in a small clearing, facing what appeared to be a stone archway. Runes were carved into its surface, glowing softly with a pale blue light. Rose recognized some of the symbols from her research. They were related to the magic of realm walking, of traversing the spaces between worlds. This was it, she realized. A gateway, a path to the Nexus she sought. The runes were a lock, and the key to Atherin, now pulsing warmly against her skin, was the key. But as Rose approached the archway, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the unmistakable whisper of a blade being drawn from its sheath. She whirled around, her own whip leaping into her hand. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure clad in armor that seemed to be woven from the very light of the forest. Their face was hidden beneath a helm shaped like a snarling beast, but their posture made their intentions clear. "Halt, intruder!" a voice commanded, ringing with authority. "You trespass on sacred ground." Rose's mind raced. Was this one of the Guardians? Some other protector of Alfheim's secrets? She had no way of knowing and no time to ponder the question. All she knew was that she had come too far to be stopped now. The fate of realms depended on her. With a deep breath, Rose readied her whip, the flames of her magic dancing along its length. Rose faced the armoured figure, her whip crackling with fiery energy. The stranger's stance was poised, ready for battle, but they made no immediate move to attack. "I seek only to prevent a great catastrophe," Rose said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I mean no harm to Alfheim or its people." The figure tilted their head as if considering her words. "And yet you carry an artifact steeped in dark magic," they said, gesturing to where the key to Atherin lay, hidden beneath Rose's cloak. "Such things are not welcome here." Rose cursed silently. The key's power must have been detectable to this guardian of Alfheim. She would have to tread carefully. "This artifact is the key to stopping an even greater darkness," she said, choosing her words with precision. "Ultranacious Eternus, the scourge of Atherin. If he is not stopped, his shadow will spread to all realms, including Alfheim." The figure was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, they lowered their blade. "Ultranacious Eternus is known to us," he said, his tone grim. "His darkness has threatened the balance before." Rose dared to hope. Then you understand why I have come. I seek the Nexus, the place where the pathways between realms converge. With the key, I can seal Atherin, trap Ultranacious within his own domain. The figure stepped closer, their armor shimmering in the ethereal light. And what do you know of such matters, Wanderer? The Nexus is not a place for mortal feet to tread. I know that if I do nothing, Ultranacious will consume everything, Rose replied, her gaze unwavering. I have seen his cruelty, felt the touch of his shadow. I will not let that happen to any other realm. There was another long pause. Then, to Rose's surprise, the figure reached up and removed his helm. Beneath was the face of an elf, ageless and beautiful, with eyes that shone with an inner light. Your determination is admirable, the elf said, his voice softer without the helm's distortion. And your cause is just. But the path you seek is perilous, even for one with your apparent strength. Rose met their gaze steadily. I have walked through fire and shadow to come this far. I will not turn back now. The elf nodded, as if coming to a decision. Very well. I will guide you to the Nexus. But know this, Rose of Atherin. The trials ahead will test more than just your skill with a whip. They will test your very soul. Rose felt a shiver run down her spine at the elf's words. But she had not come this far to be deterred by cryptic warnings. I am ready, she said simply. The elf replaced his helm and turned towards the archway. He raised a hand, tracing a complex pattern in the air. The runes on the stone flared brightly, and the space within the arch began to shimmer and ripple. Follow closely, the elf instructed. Do not stray from the path, no matter what you may see or hear. The spaces between realms are treacherous for the unwary. With those ominous words, he stepped through the archway and vanished. Rose took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. Then, with the key to Atherin pulsing against her skin, she followed her guide into the unknown. As she stepped through the portal, Rose had the sensation of being pulled in every direction at once. Colours and shapes whirled around her, indistinct and dizzying. She focused on the elf's armoured back, using them as an anchor in the chaos. Then, as suddenly as it began, the disorientation ceased. Rose found herself standing on a narrow path of what appeared to be solid light, suspended in a vast, empty space. In every direction, she could see other paths, other portals, stretching off into infinity. Welcome, the elf said, his voice echoing strangely in the void, to the in-between, the Nexus of all realms. Rose stared in awe at the sight before her. She had known intellectually that such a place must exist. But to see it, to stand at the very crossroads of existence. Beautiful, isn't it? The elf said, smiling slightly at her expression. And very, very dangerous. The beauty lay in the sheer symmetry, the precise lines and elegant design of the light paths that crossed and intersected at odd yet perfect angles. Rose felt as though she was standing in an impossibly complex machine, each piece meticulously placed to maintain the delicate balance between realms. Dangerous indeed, Rose thought. Even one misstep, one disturbance in this central integral place could have unimaginable consequences. She shivered slightly, all too aware of the weight of the key she carried, the power she wielded. Here it felt simultaneously more potent and more dangerous than ever before. The Nexus, she said, her voice a near whisper in this strange, vast place. Where precisely in this space do I seal a realm? Do I need a particular pathway? The elf guide gestured to a circular platform that hovered, seemingly unsupported, at the convergence of several of the larger light paths. There, he said. That is the keystone, the central locus. From there, with the right magic and the right artifact, he glanced meaningfully at where the key was hidden. One could, theoretically, seal off any connected realm. Rose stepped forward, but the elf held up a hand. But, he continued, as I said before, It will not be easy. The Nexus itself is a neutral space, but it has its own guardians, and they do not take kindly to interference, no matter how well-intentioned. As if summoned by those words, Rose suddenly became aware of presences around them. Figures were emerging from the light paths, tall and shimmering with an aura of power that made her magical senses tingle with apprehension. The guardians of the Nexus had arrived, and by the grim set of their features they were not pleased to find an intruder in their domain. Rose's hand tightened on her whip, but she knew that here, in this place, violence would only make things worse. She would have to rely on her words, on the strength of her conviction, to convince these ancient, implacable beings of the necessity of her actions. She stepped forward, putting herself between her guide and the approaching guardians. "I am Rose," she declared, her voice ringing out in the stillness of the in-between. "I come to seal the realm of Atherin, to prevent the spread of Ultranacious Eternus's darkness. I ask for your understanding and your aid in this task." The guardians halted, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a figure of such brilliance that it was painful to look at directly, stepped forward. "You ask for much, mortal," it said, its voice a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "To seal a realm is no small thing. It disrupts the balance, the very flow of existence. Why should we allow this?" Rose met their gaze, refusing to be cowed by their power or their presence. "Because the alternative is worse," she said simply. "Ultranacious Eternus is a blight, a cancer that will consume everything if left unchecked. Sealing Atherin is the only way to contain him." The brilliant guardian tilted its head as if considering her words. "And what of Atherin's inhabitants? Will you condemn them to darkness to save others?" Rose felt a pang at that. She had wrestled with this question herself in the long, lonely nights of her journey, but she had come to a grim conclusion. "Atherin is already lost," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of that truth. "Ultranacious shadow has spread too far, corrupted too deeply. Sealing the realm is a mercy compared to the fate that awaits them if he is allowed to continue unchecked." There was a long, heavy silence. The guardians seemed to be communicating amongst themselves, though no words were spoken. Rose waited, her heart pounding, aware that the fate of realms hung in the balance of this moment. Finally, the brilliant guardian spoke again. "Your words carry truth," it said, "and your intentions are pure. But intention alone is not enough. If you wish to wield the power to seal a realm, you must first prove yourself worthy of it." Rose felt a chill at those words. "Worthy how?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The guardian's form shimmered, and suddenly they were holding a blade of pure, radiant energy. "By trial of combat," it said, "prove your strength, your resolve, and we will grant you the right to use the keystone." Rose stared at the blade, understanding the implications. This was not just a test of her skill, but of her dedication, of how far she was willing to go to stop Ultranacious. She glanced at her guide, but the elf had stepped back, their expression unreadable. This was her trial, and hers alone. Rose took a deep breath, letting the fire within her rise to the surface. Her whip uncoiled, wreathed in magical flames. "I accept your challenge," she said, her voice steady and strong, "for the sake of all realms." The guardian nodded, a hint of respect in their luminous eyes. "Then let the trial begin." And with those words, the Nexus exploded into radiant combat, the fate of worlds hanging in the balance. Rose moved like a whirlwind of fire, her whip lashing out in arcs of searing flame. The guardian was fast, its blade of pure energy slicing through the air with blinding speed. But Rose was faster, her reflexes honed by years of combat and desperation. They danced across the central platform, the keystone, trading blows that made the very air crackle with power. The other guardians watched in silence, their expressions impassive. Rose knew she was being tested, not just in skill but in resolve. The guardian was a being of immense power. She could feel it in every blow, every clash of its weapons. To defeat it would require more than just physical prowess. It would require unwavering determination, a commitment to her cause that surpassed all else. She thought of Atherin, of the darkness that had consumed it. She thought of Ultranacious Eternus, of the evil he represented. She thought of all the realms that would fall if it was not stopped. And she felt her resolve harden into an unbreakable diamond. With a cry of effort, Rose unleashed a torrent of fire, the flames turning brilliant blue with intense heat. The guardian raised its blade to block, but the force of the blast drove it back, its feet sliding on the smooth surface of the keystone. Rose pressed her advantage, her whip a constant blur of motion. She targeted joints in the guardian's armor, gaps in its defense revealed only by careful observation during the fight. The guardian retaliated with a blast of pure, radiant energy that sent Rose flying back, skidding to the edge of the platform. But she rolled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her side, and launched herself forward again. They clashed in the center of the keystone, blades and magic locked in a stalemate of raw power. Rose stared into the faceless visor of the guardian's helm, her own face reflected in its polished surface. "Yield," the guardian said, its voice strained with effort. "You cannot win this, mortal." Rose bared her teeth in a fierce grin. "I don't have to win," she growled. "I just have to prove my resolve." And with that she disengaged, spinning away in a whirl of fire. The guardian stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the sudden lack of resistance. Rose took the opening, pouring every ounce of her remaining magic into one final strike. Her whip lashing out of pure blue-white flame towards the guardian. For a moment, the Nexus was consumed by a blinding blaze of light and fire. When it cleared, Rose was standing over the fallen guardian, her whip wrapped around its throat, a heartbeat of silence. Then, slowly, the guardian raised its hands in a gesture of surrender. "Enough," it said, its voice resonating with something like respect. "You have proven your worth, Rose of Atherin." The whip released, and Rose stepped back, allowing the guardian to rise. Around her, the other guardians were lowering their weapons, their stances relaxing. The brilliant guardian, the one who had challenged her, approached the keystone. It placed a hand on its surface, and it began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. "The keystone recognizes your right to use its power," it said. "Seal the realm, Rose. Contain the darkness." Rose stepped forward, the key to Atherin hot against her skin. This was it, the moment everything had led to. She placed the key into a slot on the keystone's surface that seemed made for it. Immediately, lines of energy began to race across the platform, converging on the spot where Atherin's light path connected to the Nexus. Rose felt the power building, a massive wave of magical energy that made her teeth ache and her hair stand on end. She poured her will into it, focusing all her intent on one goal. Seal Atherin. Trap Ultranacious. Protect the realms. The energy reached a crescendo, a blinding, deafening roar of power. Then, with a final massive surge, it blasted down Atherin's light path. In the distance, Rose saw the pathway shudder and then collapse, folding in on itself until nothing remained but a fading afterimage. It was done. Atherin was sealed. Rose sagged, the sudden absence of the massive magical energies leaving her drained and exhausted. She would have fallen, but her elf guide was there, supporting her. "You did it," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. Rose managed a tired smile. She had done it. She had stopped Ultranacious Eternus, had prevented his darkness from spreading. But as she looked at the spot where Atherin's light path had been, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sorrow. So many lives, now cut off from the rest of existence. It was a heavy price to pay, but it was a price she had been willing to pay. To protect the realms, to stop the spread of evil, she would have paid far more. After sealing Atherin and containing Ultranacious Eternus, Rose found herself back in the Nexus, the Keystone's energies slowly dissipating around her. The Guardians of the Nexus, their role in this chapter of her journey complete, began to fade back into the shimmering pathways of the in-between. Rose turned to her elf guide, a question on her lips, but they simply smiled and pointed to one of the many paths leading away from the central platform. "That way will take you out of the Nexus," they said, their voice soft but clear over the hum of ambient magic. "Follow it, and you will find yourself in a place of respite." Rose looked at the path, then back at her guide. "Thank you," she said, pouring all her gratitude into those simple words. "For everything." The elf inclined their head, a gesture of respect and farewell. Then, with a final shimmer, they too disappeared, leaving Rose alone on the keystone. Taking a deep breath, Rose stepped onto the indicated path. As she did, the nexus around her began to shift and blur, the shimmering light stretching and coalescing into a tunnel of pure, blinding radiance. She walked forward, her footsteps echoing in the strange liminal space. Gradually, the light began to dim, revealing a swirling portal ahead of her. Unlike the portals she had used to traverse the realms before, this one had a soft, inviting quality to it, its surface shimmering with hues of green and gold. Steeling herself, Rose stepped through the portal and found herself at the edge of a vast, tranquil forest. The air was pure and sweet, filled with the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant calls of unfamiliar birds. This, Rose realized, must be Verdania, the realm her elf guide had directed her to. A place of peace and solitude, far from the troubles and turbulence of the realms she had known. With a sense of cautious optimism, Rose began to make her way into the forest, letting the serenity of her surroundings wash over her. She walked for hours, maybe days, time seeming to lose its meaning beneath the emerald canopy. Just as she was starting to wonder if she should create a shelter, Rose stumbled upon a small hidden clearing, and there, nestled among the ancient trees, was a cabin. It was old but sturdy, its wooden walls weathered but still standing proud. Rose approached cautiously, but she could sense no danger, no trap. Instead, the cabin seemed to emanate a welcoming aura, as if it had been waiting for her. Rose opened the door inside. The cabin was dusty but well preserved, filled with the faint traces of old protective magic. This, Rose realized, could be her sanctuary, a place to rest, to heal, to come to terms with all that she had experienced and all that she had done. And so, with a mix of weariness and relief, Rose began to make the cabin her home. Little did she know that this peaceful interlude would be short-lived, and that the mysteries of Verdania would soon draw her back into the fray. But for now, Rose allowed herself to rest, to breathe, to simply be. In the quiet of the forest, she began to heal. It started with a simple disagreement in the village inn. A merchant, irate over a perceived slight from a customer, had begun to cause a scene. Voices were raised, tempers were flaring, and the innkeeper was looking increasingly nervous about the potential for property damage. Rose, seated in her usual corner, sighed into her drink. This was exactly the kind of disturbance she had come to this peaceful realm to avoid. But as the argument escalated, she realized that if she didn't intervene, her own tranquility would be shattered. With a resigned set to her shoulders, Rose approached the arguing pair. She positioned herself between them, her stance casual but confident. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a well-honed blade, Perhaps we can find a solution that doesn't involve shouting down the rafters." The merchant and the customer paused, turning to look at this stranger who had inserted herself into their dispute. Rose met their gazes evenly, one eyebrow slightly raised. Over the next few minutes, Rose carefully coaxed out the details of the disagreement. The merchant felt the customer had insulted his wares. The customer felt the merchant had overcharged him. With deft questions and a few well-placed observations, Rose helped the two men see the misunderstanding at the heart of their conflict. By the time she was done, the merchant was offering the customer a discount on his next purchase, and the customer was apologizing for his hasty words. The innkeeper shot Rose a grateful look as the two men shook hands and returned to their drinks. Rose settled back into her corner, satisfied that her evening of peace could continue uninterrupted. Little did she know that her small act of mediation had been noticed. Over the next few weeks, Rose found herself approached by various villagers, each with a problem they hoped she could solve. A farmer and his neighbour were arguing over a property line. Two young lovers were feuding over a misinterpreted comment. A craftsman and his apprentice were at odds over a project. At first, Rose was reluctant to get involved. She had come to this village to avoid entanglements, not to solve everyone's problems. But as she listened to each story, she found herself drawn in, her natural inclination to help overriding her desire for solitude. Soon Rose had established herself as the village's unofficial mediator. She spent her days listening to grievances, untangling misunderstandings, and brokering compromises. In exchange, the grateful villagers offered her whatever they could spare: a basket of fresh eggs, a bolt of fine cloth, a carved wooden trinket. One farmer, in a burst of enthusiasm, even gifted Rose a pair of live chickens. Rose, who had never had to care for animals before, found herself suddenly in possession of two clucking feathered companions. At first, the thought of dispatching the birds for food made Rose's stomach turn. She was a warrior, not a butcher. But as the days passed, she found herself growing surprisingly attached to the feathered duo, whom she named Spark and Ember. Soon, Rose's cabin had become a sort of unofficial menagerie. In addition to Spark and Ember, she had accumulated a pair of rabbits, Peace and Quiet, a goat, Stubborn, and a three-legged dog, Lucky. The animals provided Rose with a new kind of challenge, one that required patience, care, and the occasional firm command. As the months passed, Rose found herself settling into a comfortable routine. Her days were filled with mediating disputes, tending to her menagerie, and enjoying the simple pleasures of village life. In the evenings, she would retreat to her cabin, where she would practice her magic and reflect on her journey thus far. But even as she enjoyed this peaceful interlude, Rose knew it couldn't last forever. She was, at her core, a being of action and purpose. While the quiet life had its charms, she could feel a restlessness growing within her, a longing for something more. It came to a head one evening as Rose was settling a dispute between two farmers over the ownership of a particularly stubborn mule. As she listened to the men argue, Rose suddenly felt a sharp twinge of impatience. These petty squabbles, while important to the villagers, felt incredibly small compared to the grand battles she had fought, the world-shaping events she had been a part of. Was this really what she had been reduced to? A glorified animal herder and dispute settler? As if sensing her thoughts, Lucky, the three-legged dog, chose that moment to let out a long, mournful howl. The sound seemed to echo Rose's own internal turmoil, a cry for something more than this simple existence. That night, as Rose sat in her cabin, absent-mindedly petting Ember's soft feathers, she came to a decision. She had enjoyed her year of peace, but it was time to move on, time to find a new challenge, a new purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't find it here, in this sleepy village with its petty problems and simple joys. In the morning, Rose began to make preparations. She found good homes for her animal companions, ensuring they would be well cared for. She packed her few belongings, readying herself for the journey ahead. As she stood at the edge of the village, ready to depart, a few of the villagers came to see her off. They pressed gifts into her hands: a loaf of freshly baked bread, a warm woolen cloak, a small pouch of carefully saved coins. "Thank you," they said, their voices filled with genuine gratitude, "for everything you've done for us." Rose smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her fire magic. This year of peace, of simple human connection, had been a gift, one she would carry with her, no matter where her path led. With a final wave, Rose turned and began to walk, leaving the village and its gentle rhythms behind. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for certain: her story was far from over. After saying her goodbyes to the villagers, Rose set out on the road to the nearby city of Millhaven. It was a larger settlement, known for its bustling trade and diverse population. Rose hoped that in this new environment, she might find the challenge and purpose she craved. Upon arriving in Millhaven, Rose quickly found lodging at a modest inn near the city centre. She spent her first few days familiarising herself with the layout of the city, noting the locations of important buildings, gathering spots, and potential trouble areas. Her skills as an observer, honed over years of experience, served her well in this new setting. Rose also took the time to re-establish her network of contacts. She visited local taverns and markets, striking up conversations with merchants, travellers, and anyone who might have useful information. She was careful not to reveal too much about herself, but her natural charm and quick wit made it easy for her to gather intel without raising suspicion. As she settled into her new routine, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in Millhaven. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that permeated the city streets. At first, she attributed it to the natural wariness of city dwellers, but as the days passed, she began to hear whispers of something more sinister. It started with a group of travellers who arrived in the city one evening, their clothes torn and their faces haggard. They spoke of their village, a small settlement a few days' ride from Millhaven, being attacked by wild animals. But these were no ordinary beasts. They were described as unnaturally aggressive, their eyes glowing with a strange, sickly light. The traveller's tale was met with a mix of skepticism and concern. Some dismissed it as the ravings of exhausted, frightened people. Others whispered about ancient curses and dark magic. But Rose, with her intimate knowledge of the supernatural, knew better than to ignore such stories. Over the next few weeks, more and more tales of animal attacks began to filter into Millhaven. Each story was more unsettling than the last. Livestock slaughtered in the night, children chased by snarling wolves, even a report of a bear rampaging through a village square in broad daylight. The people of Millhaven grew increasingly uneasy. Trade caravans started to avoid the affected areas, and travellers began to stick to the main roads, afraid to venture into the wilderness. The city authorities, overwhelmed and underprepared, seemed at a loss for how to handle the crisis. Rose, however, felt a familiar stirring in her blood. This was the kind of mystery she had been craving, a problem that couldn't be solved with simple mediation or negotiation. There was something unnatural at work here, a force that threatened the safety and stability of the entire region. As she sat in her room at the inn, poring over a map of the affected villages, Rose felt a sense of purpose settle over her. She didn't know what was causing the animal attacks, but she knew she couldn't sit idly by while innocent people suffered. "Miss Rose," he said, his voice trembling, "there's been an attack. Your village, the one you stayed in before coming here. It's been hit hard." Rose felt her heart drop. The village that had shown her such kindness, that had given her a year of peace and simplicity. Attacked? "What happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp with worry. "Animals," the innkeeper said, wringing his hands. "Wolves, bears, even creatures from the sky. They came out of nowhere, rampaging through the streets. Many are injured, and some—" He trailed off, his expression grim. Rose didn't need him to finish. She could picture the scene all too clearly. The peaceful village streets turned into a nightmare of tooth and claw, the people she had come to know and care for fighting for their lives. "Some are missing," the innkeeper finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Rose felt a cold fury settle over her. This was no longer just a mystery to be solved. This was personal. The people of the village had taken her in, had given her a home when she needed it most. She owed them more than just idle curiosity. "Thank you for telling me," she said to the innkeeper, her voice calm and controlled despite the storm raging inside her. "I'll take care of this." The innkeeper nodded, looking relieved. He knew of Rose's reputation as a problem solver, though he had no idea of the true extent of her abilities. As soon as he left, Rose sprang into action. She dug into her storage chest, pulling out her leather kiss armor. She hadn't worn it in over a year, but as she slipped it on, feeling the familiar weight and texture, it was like no time had passed at all. The armor had been a constant companion through her many battles and adventures. It had been with her in Eldermire, in Concordia, in Atherin. Now it would serve her again as she faced this new threat. Rose checked her whip, ensuring it was in good condition. She packed a bag with essentials, food, water, medical supplies. She didn't know what she would be facing out there, but she wanted to be prepared for anything. As she prepared to leave, Rose paused, looking out her window at the city of Millhaven. She had come here seeking purpose, and now purpose had found her. But this wasn't how she had imagined it. Not with innocent lives at stake. Not with the spectre of some unknown evil looming over the land. She had been forged in the fires of adversity, tempered by loss and betrayal. She would not back down, not when those she cared about were in danger. With a final check of her gear, Rose set out. The journey back to the village would be likely perilous, but she barely gave it a thought. All that mattered was getting there, finding out what had happened, and putting a stop to it. As she travelled out of Millhaven, Rose's mind was already racing ahead, planning, strategizing. She didn't know what awaited her in the village, but one thing was certain. Whatever had dared to attack her peaceful haven, whatever had brought such suffering to those innocent people, it had just made the biggest mistake of its existence. For it had drawn the wrath of Rose, the guardian of flames, and she would not rest until justice was served.